Today I'm excited to dive into the world of Keith Haring, an artist who's had a huge influence on me. His art is everywhere in my studio, and I've always admired his unique style and the powerful messages behind his work. Recently, I got the chance to explore A Radiant Legacy, the new Keith Haring exhibit at Seattle's Museum of Pop Culture. MoPop gave me a preview pass, so I was able to view the exhibit before the general public did. Stepping into this exhibit feels like traveling back to 1980s New York. It's more than just a showcase of Haring's work. The music from the era fills the space, creating an immersive experience that gives you a sense of his world.
It's a fast world.
And the energy that inspired him. I also had the opportunity to sit down with Adeerya Johnson, the assistant curator of the exhibit, who shared her insights on Haring's impact on pop culture, social justice, and what it means to bring his work to Seattle right now. Her perspective helped add to my understanding of Haring's work. So today, I'll be sharing what I discovered at MoPop, the highlights from my conversation with Adeerya, and my thoughts on why Keith Haring's work continues to inspire, both in my own life and beyond. Let's get into it. Adeerya, can you quickly explain your background?
MoPop was hiring for a digital archivist. So for about almost 2 years, I worked on their online hip-hop collection, and they offered me a position to be the associate curator. So I've been associate curator for, like I said, a little over a year now. And so to work on Keith Haring, with my background being like African American studies, and currently get my PhD in gender, race, and sexuality studies, it fits really well.
What is the importance of this Keith Haring exhibit being part of MoPop, and how do you feel like that impacts Seattle as well?
I think about MoPop being a really community-based museum, and it's our exhibitions do kind of push forward these boundaries, of social justice, education, community-oriented, programming. So being in Seattle, I can definitely see how MoPop is that space for that. And I think Keith Haring does that. He highlights multiple communities, and he's been connected with youth groups, which is why we did the YAB collaboration. Seattle being a pretty big graffiti, city, this hopefully validates people's connection to graffiti. You know what? People do care about graffiti, and maybe I can be the next Keith Haring. Those things can be inspiring, and us validating, popular culture. And again, how does popular culture manifest in different marginalized groups?
What was your connection to Keith Haring, if any? Did you know much about him beforehand?
I had a jumpsuit like
Okay.
Keith Haring, yeah.
Okay.
For the longest, I didn't know that he was queer. And this is, way before I got to MoPop, but I've always been familiar. I think everybody's familiar with Keith Haring's work. It's always somewhere, It may not be on outfits, because we do see a lot of his clothes, Keith Haring, Radiant Babies, or the dog, we see so many of him everywhere. But I think learning more about the impact of his work, and him being a queer man in New York, and then dying of AIDS-related complications, that puts a different spin on his work. So I think what I do love about the exhibition is that it gives people a little bit more insight about who he was. This definitely deserved a soundtrack. And so it gives that immersive feeling. So maybe it's not a physical interactive, but it's an immersive interactive where, it's maybe I am in New York right now trying to figure out where I'm going, and I see a Keith Haring piece, on my way to work. So I think for us, just building out, music of that time, and again, music that probably Keith Haring listened to, again, being close with, John Basquiat, knowing Five Fab Freddy, again, thinking about being connected to hip hop culture, knowing LA too, and again, being around that time, hip hop was big. So having that, highlighting the punk scene, and again, just that culture of folks, in New York at the time, the underground art scene, they were connected, through those things. So again, just speaking to that time was how we kind of built that soundtrack. His intention to have, this store where people can engage in his art and to purchase pieces. And again, the profit is not important. It's just do you enjoy it? Get you a pen if you enjoy it. Here's a coloring book, It gives folks the opportunity to engage with the work, and have a piece for their own, and not be inaccessible. Because if we're thinking about, Keith Haring pieces now are going, for a whole lot of money. I don't think he would like that.
Yeah.
But that's just his legacy.
Labels are just labels. I mean, there are some people that are sort of using pop art to try to explain what they're doing, and people have tried to sort of use the word pop art to explain what I'm doing. I don't know if either one of us is doing pop art. I mean, it depends what the definition of pop art is.
Break down what pop art is, because we've touched on it briefly, but I feel like that's another thing that could have various meanings as well, you know?
What's accessible and what's popular to the community, what's familiar to folks. And I think even him, again, I don't want to assume, but my assumption of him is saying that like he's in it at the time. Angel Ortiz, also known as LA2, is a graffiti artist, and he grew up in New York, early 1980s, doing graffiti tagging, in the city. He met Keith Haring when he was about 13, 14, and he introduced Keith Haring to like the graffiti art scene in New York.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so people don't know that. LA2 will tell you that. That's what he told folks in interviews, you know what I'm saying? So like that is that connection, like introducing him to like this graffiti culture. And so for years they traveled together and did murals. LA2 has been around Andy Warhol and knows John Basquiat, and they've all hung out together and worked together. And again, the way that we see LA2's work, we can see those like calligraphy lines, we can see those bold like graffiti lines that are also apparent in Keith Haring's work. And so with that, we see like that collaboration, that impact, that influence that bridges them together. And one thing that, when I watched an interview with, LA2, he always gives respect to Keith Haring. And he doesn't feel like, like his light has been dimmed because of Keith Haring. It's just other people's perspectives of him being a Puerto Rican artist, And so I think what's great about, having him in the exhibition and, Pan Art even including his work, a lot of these pieces are new. Like majority of the things that we have of LA2 is new. So within the past, like 2 years. So again, it's like, still giving one of those originators that platform for folks to really see those connections. It emphasizes the fact that, there is a legacy that exists within like the street art scene, in New York. And I'm really happy that we can center somebody like that who's still very passionate about their art.
Keith Haring is a young artist who specializes in graffiti.
I do love to highlight, just like the pillars of hip hop. And graffiti is in those 5 pillars. So there's MCing, breakdancing, knowledge of self, DJing, and then there's graffiti. Graffiti wasn't also solely just like spraying the wall, but also they were like creating the flyers for a lot of the parties at the time. So like people who was really good at like drawing, like they also had an impact on like who had the best flyers. So even with our super large like flyer collection at MoPop, like you can see like the impact of different folks who've designed these flyers.
So how do you feel about the graffiti culture in Seattle currently?
Yeah,
I know like a couple years ago the Mirror was trying to
they're trying to crack down.
They're trying to crack down on graffiti. Like what?
Graffiti is convenient when it's convenient, but then it's inconvenient when it's not, if that makes sense. So like when we want to really do up a mural, like it'll be called a mural, and then they'll call in artists, and they'll contract an artist to design a really beautiful mural on the same wall that you probably painted over graffiti. And I think honestly, my opinion is like they don't have control over people's creativity.
Yeah.
My frustration lies in like the nuances of like what is art and what is graffiti, and that line between like who can be a muralist.
I suppose even just from the time I was a little kid, I had this tremendous guilt about, from learning all the things that white people had done. The more I learned about everything, from whether it was what they did during World War II to Japanese people in California and putting them in camps, to what they did to Indians, to the whole civil rights movement. I felt a much closer affinity to culture and people of color than I did to white culture in a way.
What are your opinions on Keith being part of like the Black community?
For me, I think it's always about privilege. If you have the privilege to raise awareness in a space that we're not here, like that is the best thing like somebody can do. The Free South Africa piece, like he's not from South Africa, you know what I'm saying? But it's just like somebody is drawing and highlighting an issue that is impacting, like South Africans, you know what I'm saying? Even highlighting the crack epidemic. That was infiltrating like Black and Latino communities, so it's like that guilt does get transferred because, people who are seeing and engaging in this may not be from that community and just kind of like, what is going on? What you mean like crack? Like, what is that? You know what I'm saying? It's like, well, let me find out. Or, you know, like, what is going on in South Africa, like apartheid, like, what is that? Whereas, like, they may not receive it from, you know, a Black person. But also, for me, it also means, what does it mean to bring people with you? So if Keith Haring is also occupying these spaces, like, who is he bringing with him to have these conversations with?
I want to reflect on, you know, Keith Haring's impact. And one of the things that is interesting is how commercialized his work is now.
Yeah.
You know, like you see it in like Uniqlo.
Yeah,
You see
I saw
it
this
on-
weekend.
Yeah, there we go.
Okay.
How do you feel about that versus, you
Yeah.
know, the original concept of the pop shop to
Yeah.
now being like somewhere around like $100 sometimes for like
Yeah.
a Keith Haring t-shirt at Uniqlo.
Yeah. I got my first like Keith Haring outfit. I think I got it from Target. I was like, hey, you know, Target it can be expensive, but I still think it leans in on the accessibility of it. Like, I think it's up to the people. Like, what do they find value in?
Being born in 2000 and growing up in Seattle, I never got to witness Keith Haring's impact firsthand. He passed away before I was born. But through his work, I've come to understand and admire him. Visiting MoPop, watching his interviews, and owning pieces like books or prints of Andy Mouse has allowed me to connect with his legacy. When we think of commercialized artists, there's often a question of morality. What values were sacrificed to achieve their reach? But Keith's work doesn't feel like that to me. He made his art accessible while also staying true to his beliefs. I believe if he were alive today, he'd still be fighting for the causes he cared about. The Keith Haring Foundation seems to honor that legacy by ensuring his work continues to support art and advocacy. To me, Keith Haring represents the power of simplicity. In a world where attention spans grow shorter every day, his ability to deliver vibrant, direct, and impactful messages through his bold lines and characters feels timeless. It's something I aspire to in my own podcast interviews and my daily life. Keith also embodies freedom. Freedom to be yourself. He wasn't afraid to be openly gay or to embrace people from all walks of life. He showed that art could be inclusive and powerful, and unlike so many artists, Keith was celebrated during his lifetime, a rare gift for any creative. So with that, I want to thank you guys for watching this video, and if you're in the Seattle area, I highly recommend checking out Keith Haring's Radiant Legacy exhibit at MoPop. Also, tell me in the comments, what's your favorite Keith Haring piece?